All right, well, welcome everybody to Promoting Persistence, Equitable Attainment Across the Landscape. Don't want to belabor the point, but I am just going to read the description for this panel for our video viewing audience. I think everybody probably in the decision-making process has already read this, but so here we go. Conversations in higher education have focused heavily in recent years on access and specifically how to increase enrollments and diversify recruitment efforts. Yet there is considerable room for debate and opportunities for improvement regarding how learners are served prior to, during, and following enrollment. For learners of systematically minoritized identities, succeeding in higher education can be elusive, due not only to a lack of access to flexible and inclusive programs, but also to a lack of evidence-based support on the path to degree or credential attainment. Our two panelists today have focused heavily on solving challenges around retention and attainment, and specifically for learners who historically have not been well supported or served on their academic journey. So with no further ado, let's dive into the questions and hear from them on progress that's been made in this area and challenges that lay ahead still. Starting with you, Kelvin, and then we'll jump over to you, Reshma. Just give a quick introduction of yourselves and answer this question. When you were reflecting on your own life, what promises were you given for the why for pursuing higher education? And how did that inform who you are and what you do today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, I'm Kelvin Bentley. I work with WGU Labs on the Business Accelerator side of our team. For the past over 20 years, I've been in higher education, working primarily with 2-year and 4-year schools, kind of the boots on the ground guy, overseeing online learning operations for those institutions. I actually worked for Blackboard for a couple years as well as a consultant, Entangled Solutions. And I'm a Michigander, native Michigander, who grew up in Detroit, and then now I live in the Austin, Texas area. So for me, I was a first-generation college student. My folks grew up in Mississippi. My dad got work with Chrysler in Detroit in the late 60s, just after the riots. Both of my parents have a high school education. And so really for my sister and I, my younger sister and I, education was very, very important because for them, they really wanted us to have opportunities beyond what they could have for various reasons, right? You know, being African American, living in the South, disparities all over the place. I mean, luckily my father's job at Chrysler was a good paying job, allowed me to actually go to a Catholic middle school and all boys Catholic high school. So both were kind of, college prep like curricula. And so that really helped. But the promise was always, if you go to college, you'll make more money. And I can go on and on because I don't want to take your time, but I'll tell you this quick story. I remember getting my PhD, which my PhD is in clinical psychology from the University of Delaware. And I remember my first teaching job, I told my dad, it's like, yeah, I finished my dissertation, I finished my pre-doctoral internship, and now I'm going to be teaching. And he asked, of course, the money question, so how much money are you going to make? And I said, well, I'm making about $37,500 as an assistant tenure track professor. And he said, I'll never forget this, he humbled me by saying, I have a high school education, but with my overtime at Chrysler, I make double your salary. Because good for him, right? Like my dad. So so there's also that too, like that it kind of like shook me up a little bit. It's like, wow, wait a minute, what is going on with college? Are there other opportunities? Yeah. Maybe I should have done something else to make more money. And but anyway, I just wanted to share that with you as well. So.
Yeah. I love that. Hi, I'm Reshma. I'm the Senior Research Scientist at WGU Academy. And the why for me was somewhat similar. So I have actually used this line in school interviews and in essays. Education for me was the one-way ticket out of poverty. That was what it was sold at. That's what I believe and still believe. And I grew up, I have wonderful parents, grew up, immigrated here from India, have an older brother who's just my role model and everything. And my parents are lovely, lovely human beings who would be like, you kids, we believe in you. You're not gonna be athletes or models. So like your brain's gonna be what gets you out of here. Like you're good. Just use your brain, study well. And so I really firmly believe that. And I studied, I went to grad school to study learning. My background is in cognitive psychology, and I study why some people are able to have higher learning and memory outcomes than others. And so my passion really is how do you develop strategies to help those who are struggling? The ones that are doing well, fantastic, claps, gold stars for them. But how do you really help those? How do you develop scalable strategies? And for me, a lot of that is how do you understand who the learner is at the core in order to be able to personalize whatever strategies you do. And so it was entirely selfish for me. I really wanted to do well in school. So then if I figured out what strategies I could use, then I could do well in school. And then I was like, oh wait, other people could benefit from this. And so I went to grad school, and that's a lot of what I research now is Academy is about 80% of our learners are systematically minoritized and trying to achieve degrees while juggling multiple jobs and family responsibilities. And so how do we research how they can learn best and scaffold that learning at different parts of the way?
That's an interesting one-way ticket out of poverty. And that ticket has certainly become increasingly expensive over the last few decades. And so I guess, Reshma, I've heard you talk before about essentially learners kind of hiring a college or an institution to do a job. And so, and in your case, it's one-way ticket out of poverty. So what are the key motivators for why someone goes to college and a specific college?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there are a lot of different reasons. I think some people go to college because they're told to go to college. Someone tells them, this is the expected path, you're on this road and you will continue. And then there are some people that go to college because it is a one-way ticket away from home, away from something, towards something else, whether that's a better job, more money, whatever the reason is. I think some people go because it's supposed to be the best 4 years of your life, and you're going to have a party and you're going to have a really fun time, and you're hoping by the end of it something lands in your lap and you're like, oh good, I'm settled. And so I think the reasons are really different, but a lot of learners hire universities to be able to help them cultivate their personal and professional identities, whether you're doing that when you're 18 at the traditional timeline or when you're 35 and you've already built up so much life experience. So I think the motivators are very different, but it very much is, from my perspective, you really are hiring the institution to perform some sort of service. Yeah.
Calvin, you have any thoughts on that? Or?
+1 on all of that. But I think the interesting thing is that, again, there's this promise that if you go to college, there will be hopefully a good job on the other end. Yeah. And of course we can debate that. I think that's not always, that one-to-one expectation is not always there for lots of different reasons. And so, I think too, it depends on who the learner is as well, right? So if you're an adult learner, right, I think traditional higher ed has found out the hard way that they have not done a great job of servicing the needs of adult learners. And, people of course poo-poo all the work, all the money that's come into certain for-profit colleges. It's like, and it's not like those colleges, held a gun against anyone's head, right? I think they did something really well, which was they were very proactive, and they said, yes, come to us, we will provide you supports. And again, we can debate certain schools, the bad actors, within that group. I would say we have our own bad actors as well. I keep telling my kids who are, I have a son who's just turned 8. I have a daughter who just turned 12. If you saw her, you would think she's older because she's already like 5'6", 5'7", which is crazy. But and for me though, I think the challenge is that ROI, right? So if you go, because there's also the branding. So if you go to an NYU or an Ivy school or whatever, there's also that promise. It's like, yes, you're going to get a job. It's going to be high paying, right? It's like a country club, right? Doors will open up to you simply because you went to these schools, and so I think that's also something that worries me as well, because I've told my kids I'm not going to take out a second mortgage on our house so that you can go to NYU. I mean, if you get in, that's great, but I'm sure there'll be other schools that you'll get in as well if you can get in there. But there's just something weird to me about paying $50, $60K for an undergraduate education, almost regardless of the major. But that's my bias, because when I applied to college, I only applied to one, Wayne State University in Detroit, 20 minutes from my house. And I knew I could get a scholarship, which I did. So basically I paid for textbooks while I lived at home. So to your point, it just depends on what you're also trying to do on the front end too. Although I look back and I go, maybe I should have gotten an apartment or something, but if I could redo it, but anyway.
Well, Reshma, we talked about the learner perspective there and what they view, kind of the job of the institution, what their job is. Kelvin's kind of touched on this a little bit, but flipping it from the institutional perspective, what do they view their role or their job as?
I don't know, changing the world. I think if you ask a lot of people, the mission is to transform lives and transform minds. But then, if you break that down, I think it's probably, there's the bottom line drives a lot for some institutions, and you can hold the lofty promise of changing minds and transforming the landscape. But I think if you break it down, it's some element of the job that the institution needs to do is, one, make money. It's a business like anything else. Hopefully make money in a morally, fine way. But is also to educate in skills, educate in knowledge, create habits of learning, and to have holistic wraparound services. So you can say, this learner came to us, we gave them the skills that we think they need, we gave them the services like the career centers, the health and wellness groups that exist, and hopefully at the end of these 2 years, 4 years, however long it takes, they're transformed. I think there's a lot of jobs that institutions believe that they're doing.
So, two different perspectives there. Based on your work and personal experiences, I'll let either one of you guys jump into this. What are the biggest mismatches between students' expectations coming in and the experiences, through the enrollment to graduation process?
I think there's lots of mismatches. I mean, I think it's tough to summarize, right? Because I think what ends up happening is that we say that we're student-centric, but we're not, right? There's lots of gaps in the system. Processes can be very, they're not as frictionless as I think institutions want them to be or understand them to be. And so I think students get really hung up on the front end, maybe, not being able to, maybe they're not educated as well by an institution in terms of, taking out loans and things like that, even though I think schools are getting better on that. I think a lot of schools, just from my perspective in online learning, one of the things that I saw, which was a huge gap, was schools rushing to pull together courses to offer fully online programs. And some of my colleagues who are here in the audience, and Amy, you can speak to this as well, but one of the things that happened was that, yes, we're going to throw classes together and we're going to put them online, and then schedules were off, and so students had to wait for certain courses before they completed their credentials. Wraparound services were incomplete, right? So we want you to be an online student, but guess what? You still have to come to campus for online, for face-to-face tutoring. So it kind of breaks the model and then breaks the expectation that you're fully online. And some schools, of course, did that really well. Others didn't for various reasons, lack of resources or back then, because I started online learning programs back in 2001, and so it was also trying to find the right technology partners to actually do some of that work. So But it's trying to find a way to really help our students not just take the courses that they need, but readily, right? So you shouldn't have to wait. Like if you're ready for a capstone course, you shouldn't have to wait a year to take. Like it should be ready when you're ready, right? And so that's why I think schools like WGU and others have really reinvented this whole idea of a schedule by, again, putting time aside and saying, yes, we're going to give you more time because learning is the variable, right? And so let's focus our attention there versus a semester or a quarter system, which is very archaic and not really helpful for the learner as they need to complete their courses in their now, right? So let's flip it. It's not about the institution. Let's be truly student-centric.
Yeah, that's fabulous. What do I have to add? So in psychology, we talk a lot about, and all over, talk a lot about conversational grounding. So are people speaking the same language? And I think a lot of what you were touching upon is an institution is speaking a language and making a lot of assumptions. And a lot of those are evidence-based, are founded upon maybe the experiences of the people who now work for that institution. So they're saying, well, the information's there. It's on the website. People know what a bursar is, right? The word bursar has nothing to do with money. Like, I'm sure it does in roots somewhere, but it just one-to-one connection, at least for me, is not there. They say the services are there. They know that tutoring exists. It's on our website. They've gotten that email. They've gotten that 1 week-long orientation where we said 10,000 words to them in an hour. Like, of course they got all of it. So that's the institutional perspective. The student perspective, there's going to be students that absolutely 100% capture everything that they need, and they're going to be fine. We can talk about some level of maybe the curriculum wasn't as hidden to them because they had generational knowledge that they'd, capitalized on. And then there are some students who are going to miss on that, and they're going to be aware that there's a mismatch, that there's a gap in their knowledge. They're going to know what office hours are, and that the office hours are free to them to use. And then there's going to be a subset of students that don't even know that they've missed anything. And so to me, the mismatches are in that last group where people they go through the experience the way they think they're supposed to go through the experience, and they might not even realize that the experience is meant to look different. Right. So a lot of mismatch happens because the onus is placed on the wrong people at different times.
Yeah. And that's, we're talking about learners on the whole kind of so far, but let's shift a little and talk about systematically minoritized learners. How does this relate to the primary barriers to attainment of a degree for those learners?
You want to take it?
Sure, yeah. I think that we're doing a lot of work in recruiting very diverse talent. At a university level, at a community college level, there's a lot of money being put into this, and there's a lot of really good intentions being put into this. There's been so much effort to expand access. I worry, though, that the responsibility and the accountability is still on the systematically minoritized individuals to seek out the wraparound services. We know that help-seeking behavior is not strong in the majority of people. Nobody really likes asking for help, especially if they're recently being let at a table that they've been excluded from for a very long time. And so, to me, a lot of the barriers that are in place is not necessarily that the resources don't exist. So I went to Washington University in St. Louis for grad school. Fantastic school, has a ton of resources, lots of money, cares a lot about the students. I don't know that a lot of the students know what all is out there. And so the barriers to attainment is a lot of you tell, don't show. You assume that just instructing means that comprehension has happened. I've done so many research studies where I'm just banging my head on the table at the end, being like, why didn't they read my mind? Why didn't my instructions immediately get them to do exactly what I wanted the behavior to be? And I think at a global level, that's a lot of the problems at various higher ed institutions. And so the barriers to attainment are it's not that the potential isn't there. It absolutely is. I think that the methods for uncovering that potential are still flawed and they're still short-sighted. And so if you have a lot of support and if you have a lot of resources for minoritized individuals as wraparound services that they need to seek out, as opposed to being embedded within your curriculum. So if you have examples, first of all, if you have staff that looks like the people that has shared experiences, that goes a long way. If you have the curriculum shaped by cultural examples that aren't all the same musicians or the same actors or the same TV shows. And if you have some of the resources where a tutor calls a student, a mentor calls a student and doesn't wait for the student to reach out to them. I think elements like that can reduce some of those barriers, but that's where I would say a lot of the barriers are.
Yeah, I love what you said too about a lot of the onus is on the student, because I think that is the case. And it's almost like we have to figure out better case management, right, for all of our students, right? Like how can we actually be much more proactive with students and also with alumni? And so like within WG Labs, we've actually started to partner with certain companies that are actually trying to provide career coaching to alumni, especially like even at WGU, because we have hundreds of thousands of alumni, but even our alumni team is strapped, right? So how can we partner with the right companies to actually maybe help us with their needs and reaching out to them versus the other way around where we reach out to them but for money. Like it's like, how can we reach out to continue to help you in your formation as a long life learner, right? As Michelle Weiss says. So yeah, I think we just need to do a much better job and really have more of a case management approach where we can have that regular outreach. So if you're a first-gen student, if you are a student of color, if you're LGBTQ, a trans student, we need to do a much better job of just reaching out to all learners, adult learners as well, because especially with adult learners, I worry they slip through the cracks very easily as well, because again, life gets in the way. You're juggling a full-time job, kids, maybe you're the sole caretaker for your parents, and so the curves, the difficulty curves just keep rising. I think the older you are and the more responsibilities you take on. So.
Yeah.
Well, access without attainment is certainly not new, but when I think about promise programs, and I'm from Tennessee, and we were not the first, but I think we were the first to offer a statewide promise program, and we've seen, like so many states that have followed, access is up, enrollment's up, but we're still not quite seeing attainment and completion. And so, not just if you were speaking to a legislator or a governor about promise programs, but just generally speaking, from your experiences, what are the most effective strategies for supporting equitable attainment and really upholding those promises made? And we've touched on some of these things, but how would you advise a governor, for instance, to not only boost access but attainment?
Yeah, well, I think we have to. I mean, we've talked about this at the conference so far. There's the skill. The focus on skills is very popular right now. So it's figuring out what is attainment, right? Is it the credential? Because we've been so focused on you've got to have a bachelor's degree or you have to have additional training outside of the bachelor's degree. Is it that, or is it more about making sure that we actually help students have those critical skills, right? Critical thinking, digital literacy, oral communication, right? Like how can we actually talk about attainment at a more micro level versus always kind of just saying, yes, if you have a bachelor's degree, you have everything you need, right? And we know that's not true because teaching can be very uneven from class to class, and so you might actually have certain skills that are actually very strong because you have really great teachers for certain courses. In other cases, that may not be the case. Maybe you crammed for the exam to pass, but you didn't really master the skills that you really need for that class, and then for other things related to what you learned in that previous class. So I think we have to maybe redefine what we're trying to achieve in terms of attainment, and then know that attainment is ongoing, right? So just because we're dealing with snapshots, right? It's cross-sectional data. So longitudinally, if we're talking about skills, how can we actually show that those skills are being, mastered or achieved at a certain level in this context, and that they actually are reinforced in other contexts? And that's a big job, right, in terms of really defining what those skills are, getting employers to actually help us to track that those skills are being brought to them at the right levels, or working with them to help their employees through partnerships with universities, or big companies like Amazon or Guild. Of course, Amazon said, no, we don't need Guild, we'll just do it ourselves in terms of skills. So I think it's all of that, but I think we have to kind of just define what is the end goal, and that a credential, a degree in and of itself may not actually be the holy grail anymore.
Yeah, I think I like all of that, and I think that being able to define it means that we'll be better able to deliver it, right? So that I think also we've been talking a lot about skills and breaking down, I think the credential and the degree into valuable skills is hugely impactful. I also think there's elements about behaviors and mindset. So being able to teach flexibility and skills and creativity for jobs that don't exist, for lives that are being created as we're all sitting here. And so I think a lot of the strategies that I've seen are really effective are focusing on the mindsets, the behaviors, and the skills together, while also affording everybody the opportunity to figure out what they want to do, right? So just the general liberal arts philosophy of use this time, however long you choose to be in whatever program you're in, to also transform your mind and have it be linked to skills, have it be linked to jobs as much as that is aligned with your values, but also use the time to transform who you are and what your beliefs are, so that then whatever you need for the next job after you finish that program, you have the mindsets and you have those behaviors kind of in place.
So before we open it up for any audience questions, let's end on a positive note here. What have you guys seen that you believe is particularly promising in this realm? And you've touched on some of it, but what makes you really excited about the future and solving a lot of these challenges?
I'm still very bullish right now on the future of competency-based education. There are questions about whether the Biden administration or the Department of Ed is really gung-ho on competency-based. I think their attention is maybe elsewhere, but I think there's already a groundswell around CBE. Like if you follow the Competency-Based Education Network and the collaboratories that they've been putting together, the resources that have been coming out of that, that's something to definitely track if you haven't already. And the good thing about that is the competency-based education is starting, we're starting to see more and more programs at community colleges. So it's not just about the usual suspects, right? It's not just about Capella's Flex programs. It's not about just WGU anymore. And so the more that we can maybe work with schools to help them pilot and scale CBE, I think that's going to be very interesting to track. The work that's also being done with employers trying to work with the Open Skills Network to identify a skills nomenclature, that's actually very promising as well. And I think, I think the pandemic shook us up enough. And again, maybe I'm optimistic a little bit on this, but I think college presidents and other forms of leadership at certain institutions are starting to rethink their existing model. Again, it's tough because the faculty are, of course, depleted. Innovation fatigue has definitely set in. So it's trying to find a way, maybe over time, to really kind of figure out, okay, what do we want to become as a 21st century institution outside of our original mission? Because I feel like digital learning, especially before the pandemic, was always a bolt-on, right? It's like we weren't actually created to be an online institution, but we'll do it but then you do it and it's not done well, and so then there are questions about, well, why are you doing it if you can't do it well? So I'm hoping that the pandemic shook up enough institutions where now they're going to be like, we need to do it well, right? We need to be a better agent of digital learning for our students. So those are some things I think about, but
Yeah.
there are many others too.
That's very, very exciting. Yeah, I'm very curious to see what the next 5 to 10 years will bring on
Yeah.
CBE especially.
Yeah.
I think what I'm most excited about is a smaller scale strategy that we at Academy have found to be really useful. So all of our learners are paired with a success coach. That's a term you'll hear a lot, and it's a term that I feel very fiercely protective over because I think it can be used almost synonymously with an advisor, with a mentor, with just any old faculty member or facilitator. And so we at Academy have very specific criteria for who a coach is and how that is very much a student-driven relationship. And the reason I'm really excited about it is because I think it's still a fairly new concept in higher education to allow students to have the space to practice non-cognitive behaviors and skills as personalized to their own life. So if we think about learning is occurring in different domains and different levels, I'm a firm believer that in order to really get to the knowledge comprehension, you need to have some foundation in the metacognitive skills. So how do you learn? How do you test yourself? How do you maximize learning so that it's not just the cramming you do the morning before an exam, but below that, I think, as a more foundational element, is the non-cognitive piece, where if somebody's motivations or if somebody's mindset, their attitude around failure impedes their optimal learning to get up to how do you learn, to get up to how do I even remember what I'm learning. And so to me, the non-cog is really a lot of the foundation. And we think about coaching as allowing learners that space to be able to apply that to their own lives, to set goals and to really take it and make it generalizable to their own lives and their own space. And when life happens, what does that look like when you're also prioritizing your education? So we've found that to be hugely impactful in terms of completing Academy and when individuals go on to more traditional universities afterwards, their success. So I really think the implementation of coaching, when it's done in a way that really puts the student at the center, I think is just hugely. I'm so excited to see where that goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you, shameless plug here, but do you want to, I mean, the results that you guys are seeing in the Academy are incredible in the comparative analysis.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that, just what
Sure.
what you're seeing from what the metacognitive learning to learn essentially and how that's helped students?
Yeah, so we have a course within Academy that is really focused on, it's an intro to communications course, so it transfers, that really focuses on building the idea of with awareness comes choice. So it starts with neuroscience. It starts with what happens when you have a threatening stimulus, what happens in your body. And how is that true when you're confronted with a bear in the woods so much as it is true when you're confronted with a math problem and the anxiety rush that might happen? How does that impair your ability to learn in the moment? And how does that then lead to the comprehension? Academy as a whole, our learners are required to take that course, which is experiential, it's cohort-based, and the learners are learning from each other as much as they are from the content or from a facilitator. And they're also required to build a foundational bit of knowledge through English or pre-calculus or a certification course. And what we're seeing is that learners that complete Academy are more likely to achieve a metric of on-time progress relative to those that didn't, after you control for the number of credits they had, a whole host of demographic identities, and really these are individuals that were rejected from the university that were then sent towards this readiness program. They were deemed not ready. They go through the program, they engage in coaching, And what we're seeing is that they're actually outperforming those that have never come through, even though they were told they weren't ready a few months prior. So it's been very, very exciting for us.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Always looking to partner. That's my plug.
Do we have any questions from the audience before we wrap?
My name is Nate Lamar. I'm with Ball State University in
Oh, yeah.
Indiana.
Nice.
Yeah.
My
Yep.
sister-in-law, she's a WGU faculty member in the College of Nursing.
Nice.
And I'm just curious, because I'm not that familiar with WGU. You mentioned the liberal arts earlier. I think my sister-in-law told me WGU does not do the liberal arts, but rather it's focused on, is it medical, computer science, engineering, and what else?
Business is so it's business. The different 4 colleges at WGU are business, IT, the Teachers College, and the College of Health Professionals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very workforce oriented.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Anybody else?
What are the, for Kelvin, you mentioned operations technology, what are the biggest barriers that you see when dealing with current technology today, whether it's a new university coming online or one that is, up and running and looking to kind of like revamp their system to really go to the next level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one challenge that I hear from certain schools that I want to, because in my job too, because I work with early stage ed tech companies, I try to see if there's a way for those companies to do pilots. And so in conversations with those schools, some of them of course say, well, we got a big operation, our faculty of course would need to be involved, and it's, just like with any technology, especially like learning management systems, right? It's like, it's hard to shift from one big technology to another big technology. It takes time. There's no, I think about like drug addiction. Like if you're addicted to, I think we're addicted to LMSs like heroin, right? And so it's hard to go from like heroin, like there's no methadone equivalent, right, in that analog. So I think that's a big challenge. And I think it's also educating the institution about that pilots are actually a good thing. Like even if you decide, you know what, we're going to stick with technology X over here versus shifting, it's actually good for you to see what is out there. And of course, but it still requires time and money. It still requires educating the faculty about it, trying to find the right faculty champion. And then the first part of your question was, just remind me
Specifically, like, is it going to be money and these types of issues, or is it going to be the literal, where are we going to house all this and operate it?
Right. And it's trying to find, I think, again, the right executive sponsorship. So depending on how an institution is organized, is it the dean? Sometimes, innovation, of course, happens through individual faculty members, but then it's working with those faculty members to then say, okay, we just don't want it to live in your one course. How can we help you talk with other faculty members about doing other pilots? I would say, though, collecting whatever data, even if it's, again, preliminary, is very helpful. I worked at a community college where we were actually doing online tutoring. This was back in 2005 with Illuminate Live. How many people remember Illuminate Live, right? Which is now Blackboard Collaborate, and eventually it'll probably go away. But at the time, we were using it for online tutoring with our existing face-to-face tutors. And I remember I was able to collect a lot of data on the back end, just showing the level of use, and that made the difference in the president saying, yes, we're going to go from piloting it to actually making it available across the board. So data is still very important, but I think it's also on the vendor side trying to figure out how can we do this pilot and not lose our shirts, right? Because you don't want to give the technology away, but it's trying to find a way to do it at a low cost. I think initially, as low as you can afford, given the margins. But then trying to find the right executive sponsor to really shepherd it, which we all know, and it's easy for me to say, but I think there's some calculus to it, because we don't really have like a playbook across institutions where we know who those executive sponsors, potential executive sponsors are. You have to do a lot of digging. If you're a salesperson, you have to sell without selling, so don't think about the sell as much, but understand the institution's problem, and then get a customer success person to help think through what the pilot will actually accomplish. What are the goals? And then what data will you collect? And then who's going to look at that data to make the ongoing decision about whether or not to stick with that new technology and scale it forward.
I think we had another question. Yeah.
Yes. Candace long-term clarity. We, the company I work for, are focused on sort of examining equity, like bias in tech, and thanks for the talk, it's really interesting to me, I learned a lot of things. I'm curious about, you mentioned, competency-based learning and how learning skills and mindset is just as important as maybe domain matter or industry matter. How does that translate to the labor market, and how maybe post-secondary is coming to the understanding that skills and competencies are more important, but then you've got to get at the end of it, and
Right.
for most people, and they say, oh, you need a bachelor's, or you need this, and you need, and for some folks, they can't afford necessarily to, enroll in a bachelor's. And I'm just curious if you know where the industry is at the moment with coming to that acceptance that like skills, maybe they can teach the domain matter, and they need people to come with the mindset and skills.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's to be continued. I think the Open Skills Network that WGU has been leading has brought certain employers like Walmart and others to kind of define what the skills are, and then hopefully there'll be, again, ongoing conversations about the assessments. So if you go to WGU or other institutions, what types of assessments might you see on the employer side later to kind of confirm that those skills are in place? But it's similar to what you said too about like we're industry, higher ed, because it's so decentralized. It's like a Tower of Babel, right? Like we're all speaking weird languages, and that's the scary thing about higher ed, because it's so decentralized. It's like cats herding cats pregnant with kittens, right? And so how do you actually like make sense of all of that? And I think the work that the OSN is doing, and then my hope too is that we can come up with, again, open competencies. I mean, there will always be intellectual property, I think, around assessments.
Yeah.
But if we can just say, if you're teaching intro to the psych, regardless of whether it's at Harvard or at a community college in Texas, in the Fort Worth area, like Tarrant County College, we agree that if you take that course, the competencies are the same. Now, the assessments that you use to determine whether or not you've mastered that, yes, maybe Harvard will have, super big, rigorous, right, experiential, all these different things. Maybe the community college will have maybe snippets of that, but not all of that. And so I think it's trying to find a way to marry all the work that we're doing. And it's tough, because if you look at IPET's data, there's over 7,000 colleges and universities, and then industry too. But I think, the signals are there, right? Amazon, Google, Walmart, other employers are really ringing the bell saying we are shifting away from a bachelor's degree as being the end-all be-all. Now, but again, it will always be and, right? So skills alone, or defining those skills, won't replace, right, or supplement having a degree, right? So it's making it much more transparent so that we can actually unpack the bachelor's, see the skills there, and if you still need a bachelor's, that's fine. But at least we'll be able to better understand at a micro level what's really going on for you. What have you actually learned? What can you actually do? And that's very murky right now in the field of higher ed.
If I could add on one thing, I think part of it is that there was a session about this yesterday, or the days are blurring together, on how the ROI hasn't yet fully been determined for this sort of skills approach. And so I think it's fantastic that a lot of these bigger companies that can afford to do this experimentation and to kind of test the waters are doing that. But I do think once we are able to better figure out what the true ROI is, and to see if we can equate the actual knowledge and the flexibility and the mindsets once somebody is in that job, if they've obtained that from a degree from University X versus University Y versus stacking certain skills versus going through a boot camp, if we can actually compare outcomes that are more objective as well as performance, I think that's when you'll see even more of the landscape shift in the labor markets. I think there's kind of a waiting period that's happening.
Are you using any of those in industry sort of doing the boot camp themselves? So that, you know, you're basically educating your future staff and it's very tailored to the culture of the company and, you know, what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good question. I'm not sure of, but
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah.
When I used to work at AWS and there was like some thing about that back then. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, AWS is very interesting. You know, again, I think they kind of shocked the world by saying, you know, again, we don't necessarily need an intermediary with schools, right? Like we're going to actually work together with schools, and we're going to kind of define the landscape. So that's very interesting. But again, to your point, like, you know, big companies like Amazon that has a lot of money can do that. But you know, I would definitely follow OSN. I think they have much to contribute because again, it's a consortium of all the major players. You know, schools, industry, you know, employers as well. So.
Okay, I think we need to wrap. We're going to do the drawing for the AirPods here in just a second. If you don't work for WGU, you're eligible. But please join me in giving a round of applause to Reshma and Kelvin, our panelists. Thank you very much.